Hey everyone, imagine the deep Mexican jungle, a place full of ancient secrets. In 1862, something impossible was found there, a giant stone head. Its features were so different from anything known in the Americas that its discoverer was completely shocked, noting its Ethiopic look. This discovery left us with huge questions. Who were these people? How did they carve and move these massive monuments? Are these simply portraits of powerful kings, or do they represent a lost connection to another continent, or even a forgotten race of giants? Before we get into the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know, what time is it on your side? They were the Olmec, a civilization so foundational and so important that historians call them the cultura madre, the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They emerged from the humid lowlands of south-central Mexico around 1500 BCE, long before the famous Maya or Aztec empires even existed. For over 1,000 years, they thrived, building a world that was complex, powerful, and deeply mysterious. Their influence was so great that almost every major civilization that came after them owes them a debt. They were the trailblazers, the original innovators of their world. The genius of the Olmec is truly staggering when you realize what they accomplished. They are believed to have developed the first known writing system in the Americas, using symbols and images to record their ideas. They understood complex mathematics and are credited with independently developing the concept of zero, a revolutionary idea that allows for much larger and more complex calculations. They invented the famous Mesoamerican ball game, which was more than just a sport, it was a sacred ritual, sometimes ending in sacrifice. They also created intricate and highly accurate calendars, showing a deep understanding of astronomy and the movements of the stars. These are not the accomplishments of a simple people, but of a deeply intelligent and observant society. Their world was centered around great ceremonial sites, the most famous being San Lorenzo and later, La Venta. These were not just cities in the way we think of them today, they were massive religious and political capitals. Imagine great earthen pyramids rising out of the jungle, huge open plazas for public gatherings, and elaborate stone thrones for their rulers. They built sophisticated drainage systems with stone-carved aqueducts. The Olmec were master traders, creating networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. They imported precious materials like jade, obsidian, and serpentine from distant lands to create their incredible art and artifacts. They had a structured society, with rulers, priests, artisans, and farmers, all working together to support a thriving civilization. For centuries, this was their world, a hub of power and culture in the heart of the jungle. And then, around 400 BCE, something happened. After more than 1,000 years of continuous development and influence, the Olmec civilization collapsed. It wasn't a slow fade into obscurity. Their great centers, like La Venta, were abandoned suddenly and deliberately. Monuments were defaced and ritually buried. It seems as if the people simply walked away from the homes and temples their ancestors had maintained for generations. There is no clear evidence of a massive invasion, and while theories like climate change or internal conflict exist, none fully explain the totality and swiftness of the disappearance. It's one of the greatest vanishing acts in human history. A void was left. Where the mother culture once stood, a void that would later be filled by the cultures they had inspired. To understand the heads, we must first appreciate the genius of their creators. But to understand the mystery, we must confront the fact that this civilization, which laid the groundwork for the Maya and the Aztecs, simply disappeared. And the giant heads they left behind are their most powerful, and most puzzling, legacy. When you stand before one of these colossal heads, the first thing that strikes you is the sheer, undeniable size. These are not small statues. The smallest of the known heads weighs around 6 tons, which is heavier than an adult elephant. The largest discovered so far is a true monster, weighing an estimated 50 tons. That's as heavy as a modern battle tank, or about 8 full-grown male elephants combined. These giants stand up to 10 feet tall, gazing out with an expression of immense power and stillness. To create something on this scale today would require heavy machinery, cranes, and advanced cutting tools. The Olmec, however, had none of these. The numbers alone present. A puzzle that has baffled engineers and archaeologists for decades, forcing us to ask a very simple, yet profound question: how did they do it? The mystery deepens dramatically when we discover where the stone came from. The material used for the heads is a type of hard, dense volcanic rock called basalt. This wasn't a stone they could find lying around in the jungle nearby. The Olmec quarried these massive boulders from the 𝐔𝐬𝐽𝐿 Mountains. Here's the truly mind-bending part. These mountains are located up to 150 kilometers, or nearly 95 miles, away from the Olmec heartland sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta, where the heads were ultimately placed. Let that sink in. They didn't just carve a 50-ton statue, they first identified a suitable boulder miles away, somehow separated it from a mountainside, and then began a journey across one of the most challenging landscapes imaginable. Their path wasn't a flat, open road. It was a treacherous mix of dense jungle, rolling hills, muddy swamps, and wide, powerful rivers. This brings us to the great transportation riddle. How, without the use of the wheel, which they didn't have for transportation, and without any large draft animals like horses or oxen to pull the weight, did they move these monoliths? The mainstream theory suggests a combination of brute force and clever logistics. The idea is that thousands of laborers would have dragged the stones over land using log rollers and massive ropes made from plant fibers. When they reached a river, they would have built enormous balsa wood rafts to float the stones downstream. On paper, this sounds plausible. It would have been an incredible feat of human organization, requiring a powerful leader who could command and feed thousands of workers for months, or even years, for a single project. But when we look closer, this official explanation starts to show some serious cracks. Log rollers work well on firm, flat ground. The Olmec territory was largely swampy marshland. How do you roll a 50-ton block through mud? The sheer weight would press the logs deep into the soft earth. And what about the rafts? The amount of buoyancy needed to keep a 50-ton stone afloat is immense. It would have required a raft of a truly colossal size, constructed with a level of engineering that is, in itself, a mystery. These weren't small, manageable problems, they were fundamental obstacles. The level of difficulty has led some to question if we are missing a key piece of the puzzle. Were the Olmecs using a forgotten technique? Did they understand acoustics, leverage, or some other law of physics that we have overlooked? When the conventional answers seem almost as impossible as the feat itself, it opens the door to more profound questions about their knowledge. And the engineering marvel doesn't stop with transportation. Once the giant boulder arrived at its destination, the work of the artist began. Each head is a unique masterpiece, a portrait of an individual with distinct facial features, expressions, and elaborate headgear. This artistry was achieved without any metal tools. The Olmec sculptors used only harder handheld stones and abrasive materials like sand and water. Imagine the patience and skill required. For countless hours, day after day, artisans would painstakingly peck, grind, and polish the incredibly hard basalt. This wasn't about brute force, it was about precision, dedication, and a deep artistic vision. They were able to capture the subtle curve of a lip, the flare of a nostril, and the intense gaze of a ruler, turning a lifeless volcanic rock into a powerful statement of identity and authority. The official explanations require a level of social organization and brute force that is staggering to contemplate. The sheer will to move mountains and then carve them with such grace and detail speaks to the power of the Olmec vision. But as we'll see, the how is only half the puzzle. The why is where the mainstream story begins to fray, leading us down a path of ritual, mutilation, and unsettling questions. After wrestling with the sheer impossibility of how these heads were made, our investigation must turn to the most important question of all: why? What purpose could possibly justify such a monumental investment of time, resources, and human effort? For archaeologists and historians, the answer is both elegant and deeply human. The dominant and most widely accepted theory is that the Olmec heads are portraits, not of gods, not of abstract concepts, but of powerful, individual Olmec rulers. In this view, each colossal face is the specific likeness of a king, a chieftain, or a high priest, immortalized in stone for all eternity. This theory forms the foundation of our modern understanding of Olmec society, painting a picture of a dynastic culture that revered its leaders and sought to project their power across the generations. The strongest evidence for this theory lies in the faces themselves. No two heads are exactly alike. When you look closely, you see the distinct characteristics of real individuals. One head might have full, rounded lips and a broad nose, while another has thinner lips and a more aquiline nose. Some have wide, serene eyes, others have a more intense, focused gaze. Some appear older, with fleshy cheeks and a stern expression, while others look younger and more vigorous. This incredible variety strongly suggests that the sculptors were not carving a generic or idealized face, they were capturing the specific likeness of a person they knew, a leader who walked among them. Just as the Romans carved busts of their emperors and the Egyptians created statues of their pharaohs, the Olmec were creating permanent records of their flesh and blood rulers. They were, in essence, the royal photographers of their day, using stone instead of film. Perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence, however, rests upon their heads. Each figure wears a unique and elaborate headdress, often described as a helmet. These are not simple hats. They are intricate creations, adorned with specific symbols, patterns, and emblems. Archaeologists believe that these helmets were the Olmec equivalent of a crown, a unique symbol of a ruler's identity, lineage, and power. For example, one helmet might feature the claws of a jaguar, a powerful animal central to Olmec cosmology, perhaps signifying that the ruler belonged to a jaguar dynasty. Another might have a depiction of a bird of prey, or abstract geometric patterns. The theory is that these symbols were like a signature, a personal emblem that immediately identified which ruler was being depicted. In a society that may not have had widespread literacy, these visual symbols would have been a clear and powerful way to communicate identity. This means the heads were not just portraits, but also biographical statements, a visual resume of the ruler's status and affiliation. To truly understand the purpose of these heads, we have to understand the role of the ruler in Olmec society. The king was more than just a political leader. He was considered a divine being, a crucial link between the physical world of humans and the supernatural realm of the gods and ancestors. He was the chief shaman, the one who could communicate with powerful deities, ensure the fertility of the land, and maintain cosmic balance. His power was absolute, not just because of his army or wealth, but because his well-being was directly tied to the well-being of the entire community. When a ruler died, it was a moment of profound crisis and uncertainty. Seen in this light, the creation of a colossal head becomes a deeply logical and necessary act. Placing a giant, permanent portrait of the ruler in the center of a ceremonial plaza served multiple functions. First, it was an overwhelming display of political authority. It was a constant reminder to the Olmec people of their leader's power, and a stark warning to any rivals. Second, it solidified the ruler's divine connection. By capturing his likeness in eternal stone, the head ensured that his divine essence and protective power would remain with the community long after his physical body was gone. The head became a sacred object in itself, a focal point for rituals designed to honor the ruler and draw upon his spiritual energy. It transformed a mortal man into an immortal ancestor, forever watching over his people. We can imagine these heads as part of a grand dynastic gallery. The Great Plaza at San Lorenzo, for instance, was once lined with these giant stone faces. It's likely that when a new king came to power, he would commission his own portrait to be carved and placed alongside those of his predecessors. This would create a powerful visual narrative of lineage and legitimate succession. It would declare to the world that he was the rightful heir to a long and powerful line of divine rulers. For an Olmec citizen walking through the plaza, the experience would have been awe-inspiring. They would be surrounded by the giant faces of their ancestral god-kings, a physical manifestation of their history, their power, and their connection to the sacred. The heads were not just art, they were the anchors of the Olmec worldview. This theory is elegant, logical, and supported by the visual evidence of the unique headdresses. It paints a clear picture of a powerful dynasty immortalizing itself in stone, a practice we see in powerful cultures all over the world. It provides a rational and satisfying explanation for why a civilization would pour so much energy into such a monumental task. It neatly explains the individuality of the faces, the symbolism of the helmets, and the strategic placement of the monuments. This is the official story, the one you will read in textbooks and hear from museum guides. But this neat explanation fails to account for some very disturbing details that suggest a much darker and stranger story. The theory that the Olmec heads are simply portraits of powerful rulers is clean, logical, and for many years, it has been the accepted story. It provides a rational motive for a massive undertaking and aligns with what we know about other ancient kingdoms. But our role here is not just to accept the easy answer. It is to be a detective, to look at all the evidence, especially the pieces that don't fit. And when we examine the Olmec heads more closely, we find that the neat, official story begins to unravel. We discover a series of deeply unsettling facts that the mainstream theory struggles to explain. These are the cracks in the consensus, troubling details that hint at a far stranger and more complex reality. The first and most obvious crack is the form of the monuments themselves. Why just heads? If the goal was to create a lasting tribute to a revered king, why not carve a full statue? In nearly every other major culture across the ancient world, from Egypt to Rome to the Olmec's own cultural descendants, the Maya rulers are frequently depicted in their full glory. The Maya carved elaborate stelae showing their kings standing tall, holding symbols of power, dressed in full ceremonial regalia. The Aztecs carved full-body statues of their gods and important figures. This practice makes sense, it captures the complete presence and majesty of the individual. Yet, the Olmec, the mother culture, chose to focus exclusively on the head. This wasn't because they lacked the skill, their smaller figurines and other artworks often depict full bodies. This was a deliberate, specific, and highly unusual choice. It's as if the body was considered completely irrelevant to the monument's purpose. This singular focus forces us to consider the profound significance of the head in Mesoamerican thought. Across Many of these ancient cultures, the head was considered the seat of the soul, the source of identity, consciousness, and spiritual energy. It was the most important part of a person. So, from one perspective, carving just the head was an act of concentrating the very essence of the ruler into the stone. The Olmec may have believed they were creating a vessel for the soul itself, and in that context, the body was merely a temporary shell. The head was eternal. But this explanation, while compelling, also opens up darker interpretations. Is a head without a body a tribute, or is it a symbol of decapitation? While it was likely meant as an honor, the imagery is undeniably stark. This intense focus suggests a belief system so centered on the power contained within the head that it created a form of art unique in the ancient world, a choice that still begs for a complete explanation. The second, and far more disturbing, enigma is the evidence of deliberate mutilation. Many of the 17 known heads show clear signs of intentional damage, inflicted long ago. We're not talking about the natural erosion of time. We are talking about systematic defacement. Noses are flattened or chipped away. Lips and eyes are damaged. Large circular pits, like craters, have been hammered into the faces, and some heads have been broken into pieces. When this damage was first studied, the immediate conclusion was that it must have been an act of desecration. The theory was that a rival tribe conquered an Olmec center and, as an ultimate act of victory, destroyed the images of the enemy rulers. Or perhaps it was an internal rebellion, with the common people rising up against their leaders and symbolically destroying their power by defacing their portraits. This is a common pattern throughout human history. When a new regime takes over, the first thing they do is pull down the statues of the old one. This explanation makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny. The damage, while extensive, often appears to be more methodical than chaotic. Rather than just smashing the heads randomly, the damage is often focused on the sensory organs, the eyes, the nose, the mouth. Furthermore, this mutilation didn't just happen at the end of the Olmec period. Evidence suggests that monuments were being mutilated and moved throughout Olmec history. This has led to a much stranger and more profound theory, that the Olmec themselves were the ones damaging the heads in a form of ritual killing. In this view, the heads were not just stone statues, they were believed to be living objects, imbued with the powerful soul force of the ruler they represented. This made them objects of immense spiritual power, a power that was beneficial while the ruler lived, but could become dangerous or uncontrolled after he died. To neutralize this power, the monument had to be ritually killed or deactivated. By breaking the nose, they stopped it from breathing. By damaging the eyes, they blinded it. By chipping the mouth, they silenced it. This wasn't an act of disrespect, it was a necessary spiritual procedure performed by the ruler's own people, perhaps by his successor. It was a way of ensuring the soul transitioned properly to the spirit world, or a way to contain a power that was too great to be left active in the physical world. This theory transforms our understanding of the heads. They cease to be simple political propaganda and become potent magical artifacts that were so powerful, they had to be ritually neutralized. If the ritual mutilation wasn't strange enough, our third enigma takes us into even deeper mystery, the intentional burial of the heads. One might expect to find these monuments toppled and left where they fell. But that is not what archaeologists discovered. At major sites like San Lorenzo, many of the heads were found to have been methodically and deliberately buried. They weren't just covered by the jungle over centuries, they were placed in long, straight lines, as if in a procession, and then huge pits were dug and the heads were interred. Imagine the staggering amount of work this would involve. First, a culture expends unimaginable effort to quarry, transport, and carve a 50-ton monument. Then, after a period of display, they expend another massive amount of effort to drag it to a specific spot and bury it deep underground. Why? Why create something so magnificent only to deliberately hide it from view? The idea that they were hiding them for safekeeping from an enemy doesn't fully hold water. The burials seem too formal, too ritualistic. It feels less like hiding treasure and more like conducting a funeral. This leads us back to the life cycle of the monument. If mutilation was the ritual killing of the head, then the burial may have been the final act, returning its spirit to the earth. The stone came from the earth, was given a human face and a divine spirit, and at the end of its ceremonial life, it was given back to the earth in a final, respectful interment. This suggests a deeply cyclical worldview, a belief in birth, life, death, and burial not just for people, but for their sacred objects as well. This idea is further supported by the discovery that many of the Olmec heads appear to be recycled from something else. Scrutiny of several heads reveals that they were likely originally massive, rectangular stone thrones. The theory is that when a ruler was alive, he sat upon his great stone throne, the seat of his power. When he died, his throne, the very object that represented his authority in life, was then recarved into his portrait head, becoming the vessel for his ancestral spirit in death. This act of transformation is incredibly profound. It connects life and death, power and ancestry, in a single, continuous loop. A ruler's legacy was not just remembered, it was physically transformed from a seat of temporal power to a face of eternal presence, which was then given its own life, its own ritual death, and its own burial. Desecrated, beheaded, and buried. This is not how a culture typically treats the memory of its greatest kings. These actions hint at a complex belief system we don't understand, one wrapped in ritual death and containment. The simple portraits of kings theory cannot fully account for this strange and dark behavior. This ambiguity, this gap between the evidence and the official explanation, has opened the door for theories that step far outside the bounds of conventional history, starting with the very faces themselves. The strange rituals of mutilation and burial force us to admit that the Olmec worldview was far more complex than the simple portraits of kings theory might suggest. These unsettling enigmas create cracks in the foundation of the official story, and through those cracks, other, more controversial theories have emerged. To continue our investigation, we must now turn our attention back to the most immediate evidence we have, the faces themselves. We must address the question that has lingered since the very first head was unearthed in 1862. It was a question born from the initial shock of the discoverer, José Melgar, when he looked upon that first colossal face and wrote that he was struck by its Ethiopic type. He was the first, but millions since have had the same thought when looking at the broad noses and full lips carved into the stone. This observation has become the seed of one of the most persistent, popular, and fiercely debated theories in American archaeology, the idea that the Olmec heads are evidence of a forgotten connection to Africa. This is the heart of the theory popularly known as the African connection or Pre-Columbian contact theory. It steps far outside the conventional narrative of isolated ancient worlds and proposes that the oceans were not barriers, but highways. The theory suggests that thousands of years ago, long before Columbus, ancient mariners successfully crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Proponents of this idea, most famously the late scholar Ivan van Sertima in his groundbreaking book, They Came Before Columbus, argue that the Olmec civilization did not just spring from the jungles of Mexico in isolation. Instead, they propose that it was either founded by or heavily influenced by visitors from Africa. Specifically, the theory often points to the Nubian-Kushite civilization of ancient Egypt. During Egypt's 25th dynasty, around 700 BCE, powerful Nubian kings ruled a vast empire and were part of a culture with a long tradition of maritime exploration on the Red Sea and possibly beyond. The argument is that these skilled African sailors navigated the Atlantic currents, arriving on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. They brought with them advanced knowledge of astronomy, pyramid building, political hierarchy, and monumental art. In this view, the sudden appearance of the sophisticated Olmec culture is explained as a transfer of technology and ideas from an older, established civilization. The colossal heads, therefore, are not just portraits of local Olmec rulers, they are portraits of these founding African kings or their immediate descendants. The distinct facial features are seen as direct, physical proof of this transatlantic contact, a snapshot of the men who brought civilization to Mesoamerica. This theory is powerful because it offers a single, dramatic solution to several mysteries. At once, the advanced nature of Olmec society, the unique appearance of the heads, and the puzzle of their origins. It paints a picture of an ancient world that was far more interconnected than we have ever imagined. As compelling as this visual argument can be, it is met with a firm and detailed rebuttal from the vast majority of mainstream archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians. Their counter-argument begins with the features themselves. While the broad noses and full lips are a striking element of the heads, anthropologists argue that these features are not exclusive to people of African descent. In fact, these exact same traits can be found among the modern indigenous populations of Mexico's Gulf Coast region, the very areas where the Olmec once thrived. The argument is that the faces we see on the colossal heads do not depict foreigners from another continent, but rather represent a powerful and accurate portrayal of the local people, a phenotype that has existed in the region for thousands of years. From this perspective, seeing the heads as African is a modern interpretation based on our own contemporary cultural and racial categories, which may not be applicable to the ancient world. Furthermore, mainstream science points out that the heads display a combination of features, some of which directly contradict a purely African origin. For instance, close examination of some of the heads reveals the presence of an epicanthic fold on the eyelids, the small flap of skin on the inner corner of the eye. This is a characteristic feature of East Asian and indigenous American populations, tracing their genetic heritage back to the original migrations across the Bering Strait. The Olmec heads are not a perfect match for any single modern population group, they are uniquely Olmec. This suggests that what we are seeing is not a literal, photographic copy of a face, but a stylized and powerful artistic representation. Ancient cultures often exaggerated certain features to convey specific ideas. The powerful jawlines could represent strength and authority, while the full lips and broad noses might have been symbols of fertility, divinity, or an idealized standard of beauty and power for their culture. The faces, in this view, are an artistic convention, a unique Olmec style, not a simple racial document. The debate over facial features and artistic interpretation could go on forever. However, the scientific method requires more than just visual interpretation, it requires hard, verifiable evidence. And it is here, in the search for concrete proof, that the African connection theory faces its greatest challenge. If a group of people from Nubian Egypt had crossed the ocean and settled in Mexico, archaeologists would expect to find some tangible trace of their presence. In over a century of extensive and meticulous archaeological excavation at Olmec sites, not a single undisputed African artifact has ever been found. There are no Egyptian tools, no Nubian pottery, no African weapons, no remnants of their clothing, and no inscriptions written in an Egyptian or Nubian language. For a contact event significant enough to found an entire civilization, the complete absence of any physical evidence is, for mainstream science, a fatal flaw in the theory. The most powerful tool we have for settling questions of ancestry is, of course, genetics. In recent decades, numerous studies have been conducted on the DNA of both ancient remains and modern indigenous populations in Mesoamerica. The results have been consistent and clear. The genetic markers show a lineage that traces back to the ancient migrations from Asia that populated the Americas, with no evidence of any significant African admixture. During the Olmec period, if there had been a group of African founders who integrated with the local population, their genetic signature would be present. To date, it has not been found. This lack of both archaeological and genetic evidence is the primary reason why the vast majority of scholars consider the African connection theory to be an unsubstantiated hypothesis. It is a theory built upon the interpretation of art, not upon a foundation of physical fact. So, where does this leave our investigation? The debate over a possible African connection remains one of the most contentious in American archaeology. On one hand, the visual evidence of the heads is undeniably striking, and it raises legitimate questions about our assumptions of the ancient world. The faces demand an explanation, and the theory of transatlantic contact provides a narrative that is both epic and alluring. It speaks to a deep human desire to find connections, to believe in a past that was more dynamic and integrated than the textbooks suggest. On the other hand, the strict requirements of the scientific method, the demand for reproducible, physical proof, have not been met. The complete absence of artifacts and the contradictory genetic evidence form a formidable barrier that the theory has not been able to overcome. It remains a powerful idea, but one that exists in the realm of interpretation rather than accepted history. The controversy itself is a testament to the power of the Olmec heads. They are so enigmatic, so potent in their silent gaze, that they inspire us to look for answers far beyond the ordinary. They force us to question everything we know about the ancient Americas. But while that theory challenges where the Olmecs came from, another theory challenges what they were. It takes the most obvious feature of the heads, their incredible size, and asks a terrifyingly simple question: what if they weren't symbolic? What if they were life-sized? Our journey has taken us deep into the jungles of Mexico and even deeper into one of history's most profound enigmas. We began with a single, colossal face staring out from the earth, and from it, we uncovered the world of its creators, the brilliant Olmec, the mother culture of Mesoamerica. We have stood in awe of their impossible engineering, questioning how they moved 50-ton stones across nearly 100 miles of unforgiving terrain without the wheel or beasts of burden. We have explored the official story, the logical and compelling theory that these are simply portraits of powerful rulers, a dynasty of god kings immortalized in stone. But our investigation could not stop there. We were confronted by the unsettling details that cracked the foundation of that simple consensus. The strange and deliberate mutilation of the heads, the methodical way they were buried, and the singular, intense focus on the head alone. These facts point not to a simple tribute, but to a complex and dark ritual, a belief system that treated these monuments as living things whose power had to be contained. This deep ambiguity has forced us to consider theories that lie on the very fringes of history, the possibility of a forgotten voyage from another continent, or the even more startling idea that these giant heads were not symbolic, but life-sized. In the end, we are left where we started, with the stones themselves. They are the only primary witnesses to the Olmec world, the only ones who saw the faces of the men they depict, who felt the hands of the artisans who carved them, and who understood the purpose for which they were made. Yet, they remain silent. The Olmec, for all their genius, left behind no grand texts to explain their motives, no Rosetta Stone to decipher their ideology. They left us a riddle without an answer, a mystery locked in volcanic rock. The final verdict belongs to the stones, and they offer no testimony. 3,000 years ago, a mysterious people hauled 50-ton stones across a jungle to carve the faces of their gods or kings. Then, they and their entire civilization vanished from the world, leaving these stone sentinels to guard a secret we may never unravel. They are the first great mystery of the Americas, and their solemn gaze challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. What do you think? Are these powerful rulers evidence of a lost voyage, or memorials to a race of giants? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.